Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving with family and friends, but we are back here yet again for another week here on the show. And to kick things off, we have a very special one ahead, starting off with a Monday night preview. Should be a fun one in the AFC between the Cleveland Browns and the Denver Broncos. Potentially another trap game that Cleveland can spring a surprise on against the Broncos. Then we go over some NFL fantasy stars. We had a lot of them because there were a lot of games taking place on a lot of different days. And we starting our positional rankings with the QBs and running backs. I decided not to, in terms of college football, talk about fantasy stars, but we will definitely be getting into college football later in the week and some exciting games there. And we're concluding today's show with my Don't Be Surprised If segment, as always, making some bold fantasy claims that you might want to monitor throughout the week. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you again, if you want to see more content such as this, consider liking, following, and subscribing to both the show and the network. Great way to keep up with all of the things we do on the network, and it's greatly appreciated in advance. But if you want to interact more directly with our shows, my show specifically, if you wish, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube, or also our website, gsmcspodcast.net, where you can leave comments and tips as well. But if you want to do it here through YouTube, the best way to do it is by just typing into your comments section. It will pop up on my screen, and I will read it aloud. Or you can just click that $ in the chat box in the comment section as well and leave a tip or donation too. But anyway, it is a great way to contribute and interact with the show, like I always say, and it just makes it that much better when you guys are putting your opinions out there, and I can't wait to see what more you provide to the show, because it's greatly appreciated by all concerned. Without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment of the day, starting off with our Monday Night Football preview. And like I said, this should be a fun one between Cleveland and Denver. Potential trap game yet again, with the Cleveland Browns can spring a surprise. They're a feisty football team. Jameis Winston has really rejuvenated this team just by being himself. You know, he's one of the great spectacles in all of football right now, and he's really guiding this team to have fun, play freely, and they do it to a T right now. And last week in the snow against Pittsburgh, not necessarily ruining Pittsburgh's Super Bowl aspirations or playoff chances or even their AFC North chances, but certainly kind of throwing a wrench into what they were building, let alone, you know, how far they could have advanced in terms of being a true AFC contender, which they still are. But it was a very bizarre win for the Cleveland Browns. And now they go up against the Denver Broncos team that currently is sitting in the last wild card spot in the AFC, and it's a pretty comfortable margin. I believe the Colts are 2 games behind them right now, and right now the Broncos feel they're in a good spot to ease into the playoffs. But this game cannot go underestimated in the minds of Broncos players and fans alike. Just because the Cleveland Browns, and just because they expended a lot of energy beating up on their Pittsburgh rivals in the snow last week, more it seemed many weeks ago, because it certainly feels like this game happened a month ago when it only happened a couple of weeks ago. But it certainly feels like the Browns are set up to play spoiler. It's not necessarily where they would want to be and where they thought this season would end up, but it's the role they feel like playing, and the Broncos are coming in potentially feeling like they control their own destiny because of the fact that, yes, the Colts are going to be dangerous down the stretch if they can string wins together. Yes, you know, the Bengals might be out of it, but there are other teams in and around where the Bengals are who might want to make a little run as well. The Broncos, though, just feel like the most complete team out of all of them right now. We haven't even mentioned Bo Nix yet, and we'll get into his play soon. But on that side of things, for the Denver Broncos, you certainly don't want to lose a game you should be winning. Let's focus more on Cleveland here, because when I look at this Cleveland team, I'm thinking to myself, why does this team always wait for the worst to happen concerning Deshaun Watson? Why does this team, even bother trying to keep him on the roster? Why does this team insist on mediocrity when Deshaun Watson is in there, when clearly veteran quarterbacks have come in and suddenly rejuvenated this team with their play? Joe Flacco did it last year and led them to the playoffs. This is not going to happen this year with Jameis, but we're clearly seeing motivations elevate. We're clearly seeing players who were underperforming starting to perform better. And while certainly this is a Cleveland Browns team with a lot more questions right now than answers, you have to wonder what Cleveland is going to do in the offseason to retool this franchise and truly make the most out of the talent they have. Because outside of Deshaun Watson, this offense is pretty decent. They have some weapons there that I really like. They have guys like Jerry Jeudy, who we know can play well, had a career game twice basically against, I believe it was, I forget who they played 2 weeks ago. It's just that long ago. But against the Steelers, had a very nice game. A lot of timely catches there. They have a guy like David Njoku, who when he's on the field and healthy, I believe is one of the top tight ends in the National Football League. They have Elijah Moore, who's been spotty all year, but we know can be a competent wide receiver too in the National Football League. So they have the talent there. It's just that if they insist on keeping Deshaun Watson for as long as this contract stays going on, and don't cut ties with him and just take the hit, I feel like this team not only is going to underperform, but players' mindsets, the morales, start to diminish because of the fact that Deshaun Watson clearly drags this team down, not just through his play, but the reactions to others around him. And Jameis Winston has done the complete opposite. He's a true motivator, no matter what he says. I know he has some crazy quotes that I always love, but he is just someone who has been leading this team in a way that Deshaun Watson never could. And as a result, that's why I feel like they can play spoilers to teams like the Denver Broncos, who I actually believe should not have been in this position in the first place. I thought this was going to be one of those years where Sean Payton will try to ease Bo Nix into his system, and Bo Nix will struggle. Maybe in the latter stages of the season, he would start picking it up. But no, he did struggle early on, but he had a little bit of a mid-season resurgence, started to cooperate a little bit more with Sean Payton, start to get more mature in the Sean Payton offense, and as a result, the Broncos have been one of the more surprising teams in the National Football League and the AFC particularly. But on the other side of the football as well, this quote-unquote no-name defense, as I like to call them, has clearly been making noise as well, and clearly been one of the main reasons why they are one of the top wildcard contenders in the AFC. This defense is physical. It can get after the quarterback. It can take the football away. Has one of the best corners, if not the best corner, in the National Football League in Pat Surtain II. And so it clearly has a formula for getting to the postseason. And I haven't even talked the betting odds because they're clearly in Denver's favor. But the reason why I'm so heavily leaning towards this potentially being a trap game is because this isn't a one-off thing for a guy like Jameis Winston. He's not just going to motivate the Browns for one game and just say, okay, now we can go back to being bad again. He is going to, for as long as he is the Cleveland Browns quarterback, continue to push his narrative, to continue to try and inspire this team to play tough down the stretch and not be just a easy win for opponents down the stretch. And that's why it's a potential trap game. But on the Denver side of things, this is a defense that I truly respect, and is a defense that is not in your division as well, and so you haven't necessarily been familiarized with them. Whereas the Browns against the Steelers, everyone kind of felt like there was going to be a sense of this could be a potential upset here. Whereas the Denver Broncos are just a well-rounded team that I feel like can compensate for all the Browns are going to try to throw at them tonight in terms of both offensively and defensively. Bo Nix has clearly grown up and matured throughout the season, in a place right now where he's playing like an Offensive Rookie of the Year candidate and clearly playing kind of playoff caliber football at the quarterback position. Whereas the Browns, yes, it was an inspired performance last week, but more often than not, throughout the entirety of the season, a unit in their defense that was at the top in the National Football League last year hasn't performed up to snuff. And so I have to err on the side of caution here in terms of picking the upset, because Denver are 5.5-point favorites, and that does seem like a lofty number. The over-under is 41.5, so potentially you may want to bet there instead of the spread. And then in terms of money lines, Denver minus 240, Cleveland plus 200, so that's also a little bit more favorable. But in terms of the spread, I look at the spread and say it might be a little bit too much, and I would really love to say the Browns cover the spread and potentially win outright. I'm looking at this game as one of those games where I'm looking at the Broncos as a collective, and I'm looking at the buy-in of all of these players, and I'm looking at how they performed. This is a team capable of beating anyone, no matter what the other team is trying to accomplish and achieve down the stretch here. I don't necessarily think the Broncos are going to pander to the Browns just because the Browns are going to try and come out there, morale's boosted, trying to take the game to the Broncos. No, this is a different Broncos team than last season's, where they were really just relying on big plays. This is a balanced Denver Broncos team that I think should be able to cover the spread comfortably and win this game outright. I think Denver's going to win this by a score of 30-21. And I feel like while the Browns will make this look closer than it actually is, a lot of their points might be scored in garbage time trying to play catch-up. Just because of the fact that I feel like that Steelers game was their end-all be-all this season. If they won that game, they could take a little bit of pride away from it, saying that they were able to one-up their divisional rival. But at the end of the day, that just expended so much energy in the snow, and now you're going up against another tough defense who really has been playing at or above the same level of the Steelers' defense in the past couple of weeks. So look for this to be a loss for Cleveland. Let me know what you think in the comments about this game. Should be a fun one, nevertheless, just because of what these two teams represent. But let me know what you think. Coming up next, though, we're going to be taking a look back at Thanksgiving weekend and talking about some NFL fantasy stars of the weekend. You don't want to miss this segment. It's always a fun one right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. Some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on today's show, however, I do want to remind you that if you do feel so inclined throughout the show, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. Just makes it move that much more smoothly, just makes it that much more better, and it's greatly appreciated in advance for all you do for the shows and the networks here as well. But without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment of today, talking about some fantasy stars of the busy Thanksgiving weekend. A lot of games to talk about, a lot of players, therefore, to talk about as well. A lot of intriguing performances, but all of these guys that I've chosen have had solid performances as well. Unfortunately, I might be a little bit frazzled here. I forgot to write down the certain amount of fantasy points some of these guys scored, so bear with me. But overall, it was a very exciting week with a lot of interesting performances from a lot of star players. A lot of these guys you might not expect to find on a fantasy stars list like this, but some of them really stepping up to the plate yet again and proving why they are stars at their respective positions. So without further ado, let's jump right into it, but bear with me as well. Starting off at the quarterback position, there were two guys that really stood out to me. One just by being vintage himself, and the other just proving why he's been one of the more stable, competent, quote-unquote system-type guys in the NFL, leading the NFL's best team. Let's start off with Jared Goff here. Jared Goff really being just his stable, consistent self. And while a lot of people are debating whether or not he's going to be in the MVP conversation, it doesn't necessarily matter if you're the best team in the NFL and playing like it week in, week out. And another consistent performance in a game in which, it certainly looked closer there at the end, and there's going to be a lot of debates about the clock management issues of the Chicago Bears, but still a very solid overall performance yet again from Jared Goff. 21 of 34, 221 yards, 2 touchdowns for a total of 16.94 fantasy points. Not too shabby by his standards at all. But as always, just someone who keeps on going under the radar from a fantasy perspective. And now I feel like this is the point where you start to think about potentially if you were a little apprehensive about Goff, whether he's on the waiver wire still or whether you have him as kind of a bench option or flex option. Now is the time to think of him as a true QB1 because he's proven that he can really step up in these situations and be who you need him to be and be a leader at the QB position for you in fantasy. But in terms of just all-out balling performances, taking it back to his Seattle days, how about Russell Wilson with one of his career highs in terms of passing yards in a game? 29 of 38, 414 yards, 3 touchdowns and 1 interception, 26.86 fantasy points, one of the more shocking results in the NFL this weekend. And I feel like, the Steelers are a team that can consistently do what they did on offense against Cincinnati. It might just be the Cincinnati defense, but I still feel like the seeds are being planted for this offense to really be special come playoff time. But this performance by Russ, no matter whether it was against one of the best defenses of all time or the Cincinnati Bengals of 2024, was still something that warrants consideration in terms of who you might be monitoring in the QB market if you're struggling to make some decisions there as well for your fantasy football playoff postseason push. But Russ has proven that in certain moments, when he's called upon, he can deliver. And yes, this game was a weird divisional rivalry, and you're going to want to see him do it against the Chiefs on Christmas and the playoffs. But for now, Russ is just someone who can, like I said, still perform because of the traits he utilizes the best of his abilities with this team and how Arthur Smith, the OC over there, is bringing them out of him. So that was a very good performance from Russ this weekend in terms of elevating his status as a potential starting option for you down the stretch. In terms of running backs, and in terms of running back rooms in general, I have to commend the Washington Commanders rushing attack, not just for this game, where they garnered 267 yards on the ground, but for the entirety of the season, in both real life and fantasy. That running back room is definitely going to continue to go under the radar because Austin Eckler, Brian Robinson Jr., and Jim McNichols are not necessarily the most appealing in terms of fantasy prospects, but they've proven to be one of the best units in that regard as well. And Brian Robinson Jr., a lot of people thought he would get a lot more touches as well, potentially being the RB1 in that offense as well, taking the job away from Eckler. And there have been some injury issues as well in this unit, but Brian Robinson has remained a paragon of consistency. 16 carries, 103 yards, 1 touchdown, 17.9 fantasy points for him. And he's been popular kind of waiver wire addition as the season has gone on. But now that I think about it, I feel like the best way forward for Washington is to utilize their rushing attack a lot more. Continue to take the pressure off Jaden Daniels in certain situations. And Brian Robinson has proven he's been one of the more consistent backs in that room who can do that. Not saying that Austin Eckler and Jamie Nichols can't, but this is a room that understands certain situations. They have guys for each and every one of those situations. And Brian Robinson just happens to be the guy who combines all the traits they need in a running back the best. His physicality, his explosiveness in the open field. And so that's why he's been such a popular addition and why I can't ignore him in this very special Commanders running back room. So that's why I feel like he warrants consideration for you, especially if you're trying to pick someone out of the waiver wire who still might be out there as a potential player you could put in your flex position, put in your RB2 position in deeper leagues and really see him shine because he is that special. And now I have to talk about a defense because we don't often talk about defenses when I do these lists because while I still appreciate them, while they definitely are one of the most important positions still out there in fantasy right now, they still kind of get underestimated in terms of importance because they can swing the games in so many different ways because they're more reliant on takeaways and sacks rather than point production. And they're not as point heavy as, say, quarterbacks and wide receivers, but they can still get the job done for you. And this has been one of the top scoring defenses in the league and one of the better fantasy defenses overall in the league as well. The Chargers defense and special teams. Yes, it was against Kirk Cousins, who's been in kind of a slump, throwing 6 interceptions in his past 3 games, 4 of them in this one alone. But the Chargers defense is a truly special one. 17 fantasy points. This is a defense I kind of underestimated a little bit when I talked about them in their game against the Bengals 2 weeks ago. I really thought they would struggle with that offensive attack, and they did turn out to do so. But they still produced one of the better halves of football against that Bengals offense than anyone has. And still it would manage to hold them to fewer points than some incredible defenses, much like the Steelers this past weekend. So that's why the Chargers defense and special teams is one that I currently see in my league on waiver wires and someone that I might want to pick up as well, just because of the fact that they generate takeaways. They score points, most importantly. And they're really starting to believe in themselves as an AFC contender. And on the stretch where they have tougher matchups, I now believe in them in terms of on the defensive side of the football to really help elevate this team and what it can do down the stretch when they're facing tough AFC West opponents beginning on Sunday night, and we'll talk about that game against the Chiefs. So that's why I have to talk about this Chargers defense because A, it's proven that it can beat up on tougher offenses, and B, it's a nice stretch of games where you can really show and prove to fantasy football owners and managers everywhere that they are truly an elite unit and not just a mirage. Because I truly think that they've earned my respect as a top fantasy unit to look out for down the stretch. And the final player, this guy's his star is shining brighter now. We know that he's has the ability to be that guy in Las Vegas who is going to be their future for the next decade or so. It is Brock Bowers. Yes, this team might not be good for another 3 to 4 years, but Brock Bowers will remain one of the best tight ends in the National Football League in that span. He's proved it over these past couple of weeks after kind of a spotty start. But this has been one of his career stretches in these past couple of weeks and against a tough opponent in the Chiefs, proving that he can go up against an elite defense and have a career day. 10 receptions, 140 yards, 1 touchdown, 30.2 fantasy points for Mr. Brock Bowers. And yes, the QB situation has been inconsistent for the Las Vegas Raiders. Nothing seems to be going right for them offensively outside of Brock Bowers. But when I look at what Brock Bowers can mean to this team on the stretch, even though they're not going to be that competitive, even though, that game against the Chiefs, they potentially should have won that had not that fumble happened. But down the stretch, it's really going to be a litmus test for the players they want to build around in Las Vegas, because chances are Antonio Pierce does stay just because of the fact he never truly got a chance to really build the squad and really dive into what it means to be a head coaching decision. And I know it sounds crazy because he's been part of the problem, but I think he stays on. So if he does stay on, Brock Bowers is going to have to be someone who he's going to have to look at and say, we need him to be the future of the franchise. How do we build around him? And so that will truly help the Raiders better understand the situation going forward and help them become a better team a little bit quicker. So the fact that Brock Bowers in these past couple of weeks has proven that he can put in elite performances against elite teams shows that he's worth investing in rather than, having this offense stagnate over a certain period of time. There's enough talent at the quarterback position in the NFL draft class, maybe not top end talent, but enough talent there where you should be confident that when you pick someone, they can immediately come in and elevate Brock Bowers' status. And as a result, he's going to continue to only get better and better as his career goes on. So look out for Brock Bowers now that he's producing in an inconsistent offense to get even better down the stretch in more years as he gets better and better offense around. But let me know what you think about this list in the comments, because coming up next, we start our positional rankings for Week 14 of the NFL season. It's moving by fast with our QBs. I love this position group just because it's been a lot deeper than a lot of people might have expected. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about it a little bit more.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, we start our positional rankings for the week with the QB position. This is perhaps my favorite ranking to do all week, just because of the depth of the QB position and the surprises we've had here. And this list is full of them. Maybe just one of these guys is seen as a true fantasy star, whereas all the others or more opportunistic matchup type guys who truly have surprised and shocked this season. And I think, there are some tough matchups here. And they're not gimmies for any of these guys by any stretch of the imagination. Because, like I said, these are still quarterbacks who are a little bit mortal than the superstars out there in the league, outside of one that I'm going to talk about at the end. But overall, I'm trying to make this list as fair and as even as possible, because I know that a lot of fantasy people are going to be talking about, well, I always try and start my stars, but sometimes, stars don't always shine, and sometimes you have to look a little bit deeper into the talent pool in certain positions, and sometimes you'll find some hidden gems there. I know that I've been doing a lot of searching in my fantasy league as well, and it's the reason why I'm in an advantageous position to advance to the fantasy playoffs, even though I am in a currently very, very bad losing streak in my own fantasy league. But still, taking advantage of kind of mid-tier talent goes to show that this position is deepening and deepening even more. So without further ado, let's just talk about our top quarterbacks for Week 14 here. Starting off with a guy who kind of had an underwhelming weekend against a team that you would have expected him to put up a lot more numbers against, but still someone who is reliable in certain situations, reliable in the clutch, much like he was yesterday against Carolina, but still potentially someone who is a very boom or bust kind of guy. And that, of course, is Baker Mayfield. Going with the Raiders, only 10.2 fantasy points this weekend against Carolina. And it's a little bit kind of embarrassing, a little bit kind of shaky in that regard for a guy who we know can put up big numbers from a fantasy perspective. I know personally I see it as my starting QB. But I feel like the thing with Baker is that he just trusts himself a lot. No matter when the going gets rough, he knows that he can do enough in certain situations to keep his team in football games. He's been doing that very effectively over the past couple of weeks for the Bucs. Even that little losing streak after they lost Evans and Godwin, he kept them competitive and he kept them in games. And he really proved his mettle in terms of how this Bucs team trusts him. And so against the Raiders, another really weird kind of trap gamey opponent potentially for Tampa Bay this next weekend. But I feel like Baker's going to have enough in the tank to put up another solid performance here. Because the Raiders are a team that, like I said, they're going to have to decide a lot of things in the offseason and who they want to keep and who they want to kind of offload. But they still are a team you can't underestimate, especially on the defensive side of the football. They still have a guy like Max Crosby there who could be a game wrecker. So it's no easy game by any stretch of the imagination against this Raiders team, who I still in some ways respect. But I do think that Baker Mayfield is just someone who rolls with the punches no matter what's going on. And I kind of like that in a fantasy quarterback, even though you have to take the bad with the good. So even though he's a risky kind of pick in certain situations, especially in these kind of trap game-like situations, he is still someone who merits consideration week in, week out down the stretch, especially as his Bucs are fighting for that NFC South title. The next guy is another guy who's been kind of shocking this season, but hasn't played as much as Mayfield these past couple of years because he's been bouncing around as a journeyman, the former number 3 overall pick. My dad will like this one. How about Sam Darnold going up against a guy who was the former quarterback of his Minnesota Vikings in Kirk Cousins and the Falcons this weekend? And it should be a very interesting game there. Can Sam Darnold prove that the Vikings made the right decision? Well, not technically not the right decision because J.J. McCarthy was supposed to start, but using Sam Darnold as a backup, keeping him, retaining him, and allowing him to develop, can it pay off against Kirk Cousins and company in the Falcons? And I think it will because, like I say, the Falcons are a pass defense you just always have to look out for in terms of whether or not your QB is facing them because they are awful. And it's no indictment of Atlanta. They're still in the wild card race and still in the NFC South title race. They still have the tiebreaker over the Bucs. But let's be real here. This team is on a atrocious run of form these past couple of weeks. Kirk Cousins has looked terrible. This defense has looked terrible. And so, even though Sam Darnold has kind of cooled down a little bit, especially after the bye, he still is someone who is effective in this Minnesota offense, still has the weapons around him, most importantly, to put up gaudy numbers in terms of real life and fantasy. And 19.6 fantasy points versus Arizona. Really gutsy performance there in a comeback win. He's still proving that he has the moxie and swagger needed at the QB position to elevate his team, most importantly, put up decent stats for you. Now, I know he's going to be a risk in bigger games down the stretch, so he's not always going to make this list, but he's still someone that's been a fun emergence in terms of the fantasy football position. And so, I feel like, week in, week out, Darnold's been proving that, yes, he still has some of that rust from the Jets and his journeys around the football league on him, but he still is someone who, if you shake a little bit of the rust away, could be a potential gem in certain situations. And against the Falcons, against the former quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings, he's going to have a field day, I personally think. But overall, it's up to you how you view Sam Darnold, because he is a very interesting quarterback. Because he still is Sam Darnold and he still does some Sam Darnold-y things. But he is still someone who merits consideration week in, week out in fantasy. As Tap to Learn enters the chat and says, will Michael Penix start in this game? And I feel like, it will be funny if he does, but think about Kirk Cousins' situation, the Falcons' situation, more importantly. This is a $180 million investment that up to this point hasn't necessarily worked in the past couple of weeks, but still is in a position to make the playoffs. You're going to be throwing a guy in Michael Penix Jr. who has a lot of college experience, one of the most experienced QBs coming out of that draft class. But in this situation, when Atlanta still controls its own destiny, has the tiebreaker over the Bucs, most importantly, in the division, to bring a guy in Michael Penix, who's a rookie and is an old one at that, into that situation and ask him to lead this Atlanta Falcons team to the promised land, is a little bit sketchy. And not for nothing, I know that Kirk Cousins is not someone who kind of foments hope right now, but he's still led him to the spot, and he still should be given the reins this weekend and the next weeks because of the fact they're still in position to make a playoff run here. They still control their own destiny, whereas the Bucs will have a lot of work to do in terms of trying to win enough games to beat Atlanta outright. So I just think that would be a weird situation there in Atlanta should Penix get some starting time. Next quarterback I want to talk about plays tonight in an interesting matchup that I don't necessarily think he'll win, but will prove that he could have value next week, as he's in one of the two teams next week playing a divisional opponent in a meaningful game for the second time in 3 weeks. Jameis Winston going up with the Steelers again next week. Obviously, we don't know what he'll do tonight, so I can't necessarily tell you in terms of fantasy production what he'll do next week. But why not have him come out here twice in a row and beat up on the Steelers and kind of hinder their chances at, say, a first-round bye or an early home game in the playoffs. And I feel like it's not going to be an indictment of the Steelers if Jameis does well, but it's just the way that Jameis allows his team to view divisional opponents no matter what, and allows them to view other opponents as well in stretch. This Broncos game is going to be a tough one, and I said as much in that opening segment. But I do feel like in certain moments, Jameis Winston can be a fun prospect from a fantasy perspective. A lot of you might be a little bit skeptical and apprehensive about starting a guy like Jameis just because of the fact he still has turnovers in his game. It's just his MO to throw the football as much as possible, be aggressive in the pass game. But like Baker Mayfield, you have to take your peaks with your valleys a little bit. And Jameis in these divisional games has proven he's going to want to do enough to help his team. Most importantly, put up good numbers while doing it. In that snow game, had one of his better games this season. So look for Jameis to potentially be an excitable option this weekend in terms of how you view the quarterback position. Because right now, you might be saying, well, I'm set, I'm in position for a deep fantasy playoff run, and I don't need to add any QBs. Well, chances are your QB room isn't as deep as you think, and you might want to pick a guy who could step in a flex position or in deeper leagues a QB2 position, like Jameis, who you know can put up big numbers. And yes, you know, the Browns might end up being an easy win for a lot of teams in the stretch, but Jameis has proven that even in easy wins, he can put up big numbers, much like he did against, I believe it was, the Saints in that blowout loss, much like he did against the Chargers in that blowout loss. He still is someone who puts up consistent numbers, and I feel can really help you effectively in a fantasy perspective. And the last guy I want to talk about is ultimately the big star out of all four of these guys, a guy who would start week in, week out, no matter what, but still is in a pretty bad situation, a Marino-like situation, if you will, kind of a running joke there here at GSMC. But Joe Burrow, still one of the premier fantasy quarterbacks, regardless of how bad his team is in real life. It's not his fault he can't play defense. It's not his fault that the defense has been lagging behind this offense, who I believe is the only team in NFL history to lose, 6 games while scoring 30-plus or more points, and I believe 4 times where they scored 25-plus or more and lost as well. But against the Cowboys, this should be an exciting game in which Burrow is going to go up against a defense that has been looking better of late and surprisingly has the same record as the Bengals at this point in the season. I know it's a very weird NFL season we have here where a dumpster fire Cowboys team has the same record as a historically good Bengals offense combined with a historically bad Bengals defense. So this could truly make for a bizarre game in terms of a fantasy perspective. I could get a little bit drunken in terms of how this game flows, but overall, I can't deny what Joe Burrow means to the world of fantasy, because even in dire straits in Cincinnati right now, Joe Burrow is doing his best to lead his team to victory. And he has the offense, he has the weapons, and he has the arm. It's just that, you're looking at a 5-7 Bengals team. That's all that's unappealing about Joe Burrow right now, is that he sits on a 5-7 Bengals team that's not going to make the playoffs. But ultimately, from a fantasy football perspective, none of that matters because you yourself are trying to win fantasy football games, get into the playoffs and make a deep run, and Joe Burrow should be that guy on the stretch for you. Just because, he's someone who is on a bad team does not mean he's going to start to play bad himself, because he's playing an MVP caliber level right now that we can't ignore in fantasy circles everywhere. So I just had to acknowledge him and what he means to the QB position this week. But overall, let me know what you think of this list. I tried to diversify it a little bit, tried to make it as deep as possible in terms of the level of play these quarterbacks have played at this season. But coming up next, we transition to a tougher position to talk about, the running back position. A lot of weird stuff happening there that you definitely don't want to miss after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of the day here on the show, we transition from QBs to running backs. It should be a weirdly difficult position to examine at this point just because of the volatility there. It's not necessarily the easiest position to talk about. There still are some high-level guys, but there's a lot of different mid-tier guys who either are overperforming in certain situations or underperforming in certain matchups. It just makes for a very difficult time to analyze this position because of the fact that we don't necessarily know how to differentiate it at this point. But nevertheless, I'm going to try and make some sense of this, help you guys out, because there still is depth to be had here. There still is certain prospects about this fantasy position that I feel like will stand out in the next couple of weeks, whether for worse or for better. So let's start off talking about some guys here. 4 guys specifically who might not fit into any category at this point, but I think in these respective matchups can put up respectable numbers. Starting off with a guy who is in a very nice little running back tandem over there in Detroit, and kind of does take a little bit of a backseat, especially this season in terms of touches and target share. But I think in this matchup, in the NFC North, he's going to have to really step up his game and truly confuse this stellar Packers defense. Jahmyr Gibbs going up against the Packers only had 10.4 fantasy points versus Chicago after he had a stretch of decent weeks from a fantasy perspective over those past couple of weeks before that Thanksgiving matchup. But going up against the Packers this weekend, this is going to be an interesting examination of 2 offenses that are starkly similar for 2 divisional rivals. Both of these teams kind of have not necessarily system-type QBs over there for the Packers, because I think Jordan Love is starting to become someone who's either elite or not, and will be put into one of those categories at the end of the season, depending on what the Packers do in the playoffs. But 2 guys who kind of rely on efficiency more than explosiveness down the field, but really rely on their run game to get them going as well. And for the Detroit Lions, I feel like that's going to stand a little bit more because they have 2 guys who are truly elite backs in Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. But what I think is going to happen in this game is that because the Detroit Lions really want to separate themselves from the rest of the pack in that division, they're going to utilize so many different looks in the run game to truly get this offense going. Jared Goff's going to try and remain as efficient as possible against the defense that thrives on the takeaway. And it's going to stem down to consistency from both Montgomery and Gibbs in the run game. And that's why I think that Jahmyr Gibbs is really going to have to elevate his game this weekend, and I think he will do so just because of the fact that I can't ignore that when a running back room is that deep, they have two guys they rely on, the fact that any one of those guys can get hot at any one time. And we've seen it time and time again this season for Detroit. And I think this is Gibbs' time to really stand out in perhaps the most pivotal game of the Lions season up to this point. So look for Jahmyr Gibbs to really stand out this week against a tough divisional opponent. And then let's talk about a guy who's really going to have to step up a little bit more in this Jags offense on this stretch. Maybe not the most appealing of options just because the Jags are not the most appealing of teams, but nevertheless still someone who has really shown his fantasy colors this season, really grown up into being a guy who you might be looking at for years to come at the running back position from a fantasy perspective. Tank Bigsby. Only 4.5 fantasy points versus Houston. Pretty quiet day for him, which is a surprise considering the fact that Trevor Lawrence went down with that harrowing injury. But I do think his development in this offense is going to be monitored by a lot of fantasy football managers down the stretch here. Because if he proves that he's truly legitimately someone worth building around for Jacksonville, and Jacksonville does invest in trying to build a nice little QB running back tandem with him and Lawrence, then I feel like fantasy football managers would be justified in trying to take more risk with him, even though the Jags might not be this efficient to end the season. But I still have to look at some of these teams and see the positives in them, right? And when I look at Jacksonville, I see a positive in the run game in a guy like Tank Bigsby. And against the Titans, yes, they are a physical, tough defense in the run. I think that they can take advantage of it. They just got gashed by Washington and their stellar running back room, and Tank Bigsby is a guy who's going to be very physical in this matchup and really going to help this Jags offense try and move the football as much as possible against this Titans defense. So look for Tank Bigsby to really be someone who may not have as many stellar performances down the stretch as he did to start the season, but someone who you're going to have to respect going forward and in future years in certain fantasy drafts going forward for you as well. Not just a one-year thing for Tank Bigsby. Look for him to continue to develop and be a consistent running back in fantasy for years to come. Then let's talk about just one that I view in terms of matchups and how this guy really could have a big game, and not necessarily, guaranteed to have one. Let's talk about Alvin Kamara right now, because Alvin Kamara is someone who I feel like needs to be trusted a little bit more in this Saints offense. Did have 15.9 fantasy points versus LA, but especially down the stretch in that one. Especially on those last couple of plays in the drive where they were trying to tie the score. He should have gotten the ball a little bit more, right? Because Alvin Kamara is your best piece. Yes, he's aging, and it's a contract situation for him and other Saints stars are going to start to get more difficult. The Saints definitely don't look like they're going to be retaining many of these star players. But Alvin Kamara, for what it's worth right now, is still one of the more consistent fantasy running backs in the National Football League. And out of all of these guys, he's the one that I feel like is most likely to warrant consideration as someone who starts week in, week out. I know a lot of people have kind of lost faith in him a little bit, maybe because of how lackluster the Saints offense was after that exciting start, but right now, more than ever, I feel like the Saints want to feed Alvin Kamara for as long as he's there and continue to get the best out of him while they still can. Because in the long run, Alvin Kamara is not necessarily going to help you that much as a New Orleans Saints organization. He is someone that I might have to look at letting go this offseason. But, you could have a Derrick Henry-like rejuvenation in the future, and who knows, potentially help a potential playoff contender really be a surprise team next year. So, Alvin Kamara right now is someone who you really want to look into and really trust down the stretch, because the Saints are going to grind him to the bone these next couple of weeks, potentially knowing that it's a swan song, but potentially as a fantasy football manager, you want to take advantage of this and say, I'm going to take the best out of him and potentially his last games in the Saints uniform and see where his career goes from here, much like you probably do with Derrick Henry. And go back to the Giants, it's a good start because the Giants right now, I watched them on Thanksgiving, and let's just say I do not want to be a Giants fan. I'm glad that as a tri-state area guy, I picked a different team growing up. But overall, Alvin Kamara is such a fun guy as always in fantasy because you never know what his production is going to look like week in, week out because of his versatility as an athlete for the New Orleans Saints. And the last guy I was going to pick was Christian McCaffrey against the Bears, but obviously we know how that's ended up. Hope for a speedy recovery for him, even though as a Seattle fan, he's been terrorizing me for years, and I don't want this 49ers team to get hot without him, but I do hope for a speedy recovery from him. And I know it frustrates a lot of fantasy managers to see him go down like this, but I do feel like there's something to be said about the depth of the San Francisco 49ers running back room because it's surprising to say the least. And I feel like, the game against the Bills wasn't indicative of what these secondary options in the running game can do. But when they were given the opportunity, they were probably the best aspects of that 49ers offense last night. Besides, Deebo Samuel trying his best to give this team good field position in the kick return game and risking his own injury status as well in that regard. But talking about the San Francisco 49ers running room, why not, buy into them a little bit more? Because a lot of people bought into Jordan Mason as soon as he got hot early in the season. So why not now? Because right now the 49ers, they're in dire straits. They're not necessarily, quote-unquote, a dumpster fire like other teams around them have the same record. But they are in a situation where they have to get the best out of their depth. And it hasn't happened to date. But some of the best times that has happened throughout the season have stemmed from Jordan Mason, has stemmed from Jawad Jennings. So you have to get the most out of these guys in certain situations to get going. So look for Jordan Mason to get back to what he was early in the season when McCaffrey was also injured during that time. So something that's a little bit, frustrating coming from someone who understands that if you had a number one overall draft pick, you invest a lot in Christian McCaffrey, but it's still a situation where it's not necessarily the worst. But we know what you think about it in terms of the comments section. But coming up next to conclude today's show is my Don't Be Surprised If segment, my favorite segment to talk about my bold fantasy claims for Week 14 of the NFL season, right after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And this last segment is always a fun one to talk about, my Don't Be Surprised If segment, but it's starting to get a little bit more repetitive, shall we say, but I do feel like it's still exciting, especially as we get on the stretch, because while the NFL is winding down, while these are going to start to get a little bit more bittersweet in certain moments, I still think there's merit in terms of trying to figure out what kind of situation certain players are in, what situation certain teams are in, and how we start to view them in the stretch with fantasy perspective. Because, like I said, all these different teams, no matter where they are in the standings, no matter what their record shows, still have merit, including some of these players here. So I try to be generous to all these teams in the stretch, but just know that these predictions are going to start to get a little bit more, shall we say, predictable down the stretch. But without further ado, for now, as we can still get more fun predictions out there as well, let's jump right into the fifth and final segment of today's show, my Don't Be Surprised If segment. Starting off with a guy who has truly been red hot over these past couple of weeks and will continue this hot streak, I believe, down the stretch for a Tennessee Titans team that, like I said, is one of those teams that you kind of want to write off from a fantasy perspective just because they're not that appealing. But this guy you might want to buy into on the stretch out the waiver wire if you want to make that fantasy playoff push, and that is Nick Westbrook-Akine. He is someone who is really changing the trajectory of what I think about the Titans' future. I'm not sure how old he is actually. He's been with this team quite some time, but he is someone who I feel like they might want to invest in a little bit more on the stretch because he's truly brought the best out of Will Levis's best traits. He still is only 27 years old, so you can still get some good years out of Nick Westbrook-Akine and Will Levis here if you truly want that to be the combination for you in Tennessee. But this past stretch of games has proven that Will Levis has some traits that can be tapped into, that can be brought out by a guy who's experienced like Nick Westbrook-Akine in this offense. And so that's why, even though the Titans are not a good football team and they might not win many more games this season, Nick Westbrook-Akine is going to be so important on this stretch for them. And as a result, we'll see his fantasy prediction continue to arise against the Washington Commanders this weekend. He had 2 touchdowns as well. So look for him to continue developing that hot streak for this Titans team. And I feel like, even if they decide to move on from Will Levis and perhaps Brian Callahan after this season, Nick Westbrook-Akine is going to be someone that whoever the next quarterback is will be glad to have just because of experience in this team, what he can do in a lot of different areas as a wide receiver for them. But that's just my first prediction. My second prediction, a little bit more bold in nature here. How about Aaron Rodgers spoiling the Dolphins' fun with a top 10 fantasy performance? I continue trying to buy into Aaron Rodgers, and yesterday, as a Seattle fan watching that game, I feel like Aaron Rodgers was awful. Yes, he had 2 touchdowns, but I went on short field, and they should never have happened. The rest of the game, when he was forced to drive the ball on the football field, he simply did not deliver. He had to miss some wide open throws, and he truly did not look like he was on the same page as the other members of his offense. But I feel like, in a divisional matchup, anything could happen. And the Dolphins, still technically in the playoff race, but more or less out of it because of that loss to the Packers. I feel like, they let their guard down a little bit, and Aaron Rodgers might be able to bring a surprise on them. He still has the offensive weapons and talent to put up a good performance. It's just a matter of getting the football to them. And so, even though, for as putrid as he's been playing, he is still someone who potentially could shock down the stretch, even though it seems like a long shot in certain moments. But, like I said, divisional matchup here. Anything can happen with this team, whether negative or positive, and I'm willing to buy into it. Just because this Jets team right now is not in a good place, and they're going to have to figure it out in the offseason. But for now, it is what it is, and they're going to have to roll with the punches these last couple of games this season. And, potentially, I could be very wrong about this take, but Aaron Rodgers is still someone who's capable of getting a game in which he performs well. It's just a matter of being on the same page. And that's what this Jets offense really needs out of him in this game. But I just wanted to have this nice little long shot bet here that I think if the cards fall on that Sunday for the Jets could actually happen. And then our fourth segment, our third one of the day rather, here on the Don't Be Surprised If segment was a guy we talked about a little bit throughout the show, Jameis Winston repeating his snow game success with the top 5 fantasy performance. And yes, it's wild to predict a quarterback will do something similar twice in 3 weeks. The Seahawks are going to try to do that. I think the Cardinals as well. But I just feel like, it doesn't matter who Jameis Winston plays. He's always going to want to be that aggressive guy who just throws the football and trusts his team. But, this feels like the team that has trusted him the most throughout his career in the NFL, the Cleveland Browns. They truly have bought into this effervescence he's brought to the locker room, this brightness, this spirit, this rejuvenation that he's brought to the locker room. And I just feel like at this moment in time for the Cleveland Browns, looking at this game, after the emotionality of that last one, at home in the snow in Cleveland, their personal Super Bowl, and how it translates to having to go on the road to Pittsburgh in a hostile environment and try and do it again, it certainly feels daunting. But, as Jameis said, the horse is prepared for battle. And so, I feel like, it's tough to predict what two teams who face each other so often, especially in the span of 3 weeks, will do in another matchup, but chances are the Browns will find positives yet again throughout this game as well, because they proved that in certain ways you can move the football in them. Jameis was very timely in this game. He didn't necessarily have the best stat line in that game, but he was timely. Most importantly, he was efficient. He did have one ugly pick in that one, but it didn't end up mattering. He kept this offense on schedule, and if you keep this offense on schedule against the Steelers' defense, chances are you can put up points in it, much like we saw the Bengals do yesterday as well. So this isn't necessarily the most daunting of tasks for Jameis. It's going to be a matter of how many points he can put up, what his numbers will look like at the end of the game, and most importantly, whether or not this is a winning or losing effort, because Jameis Winston is boom or bust no matter win or lose. But most importantly, what I can take away from what we saw from him in the first iteration of this game is that he's willing to allow his game to speak for itself. And I know it sounds cliche, and I know it sounds motivational, like a Jameis-like quote to say, but he just allows the game to come to him. It allows the game's flow to speak for itself. And he just settles into that pocket and just does what he has to do. And whether or not it's pretty is up to the play of Jameis Winston himself. But what I can say is that he will always, always try and motivate his team no matter what. And chances are it could translate to on-field success. Like I said, the most daunting task for any team is to beat a team twice in the span of 2 weeks. But if there's anyone who's been motivating his team, who's been uplifting certain players, who's been elevating their play the most these past couple of weeks in a team who needed this moment, it's Jameis Winston. And that's what's special about what the Browns have done, because they were in a very dire place with Deshaun Watson. And when he went down, it's weird to say there was a sense of relief, but I feel like that's what it was, because they really wanted some sort of rejuvenation, some reinvigoration of spirit in this team. That's what Jameis has provided for them. So look for him in a tough task yet again against the Steelers to match that repeat success in the snow game from 2 weeks ago, in this one against Pittsburgh, at their place as well. And that's what will make it that much more special. But the last kind of claim that I want to make here, for I don't be surprised if segment, as always, is talking about potentially most underrated QB matchup of the weekend. Bryce Young taking on Jalen Hurts. This one has a chance to be truly unexpected in terms of the fantasy production that can be reaped from it. And I feel like a lot of people were willing to give up on the prospect of Bryce Young truly becoming something, especially from a fantasy perspective. I don't necessarily think anyone would have expected this resurgence from Bryce Young in these past couple of weeks, but he's really proven his mettle for this team down the stretch. He's really proven that he can be competent in certain situations, especially in the clutch of these past couple of weeks, even in losses. He got the job done to send those games into overtime, and it wasn't his fault that he didn't get the ball or that Chuba Hubbard fumbled on that possession. He did everything right in those situations, and he's proven that he can lead an NFL offense. And whether or not his future lies in Carolina, he's truly proven that he can be a leader of a team that's kind of rebuilding, trying to build up spirits for a nice run of form in years to come. Whereas Jalen Hurts has just been someone who has been pretty consistent as well in terms of his play. And maybe he does rely on Saquon a little bit more than usual, but Jalen Hurts, there's something to be said about his command of this offense as well. And a lot of people are a little bit annoyed at what that means, what that entails for this team, but there's something to be said about his control and his understanding, most importantly, of what his offense needs from him. And that's what makes this game so intriguing. Look for this to be one of the most shocking games of the weekend, both in real life and in fantasy. Let me know what you think in the comments, because that will just about do it for today's show. Thank you all for tuning in. I've been Christopher Shepard here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network. Make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features as well. We'll be back tomorrow at 3:30 Eastern Standard Time for more fantasy sports talk. But other than that, I am out for today.